Mexico feels like it has an ace right now in its high-stakes diplomatic game with Donald Trump. In a phone call last Thursday, she persuaded Trump to suspend the US's 25% tariffs on most Mexican goods. He said he did it to accommodate her.
The unfolding of events that led to the complete halt of agricultural exports from Mexico to the United States stands as a vivid example of how shifts in political rhetoric and trade policy can reverberate across borders, shaking long-established economic relationships. The decision came at a time when the political climate in the United States was charged with new ideas about protecting domestic industries. And it marked a dramatic turn in what had been a symbiotic trade relationship between the neighboring nations. The newly elected U.S. president, known for his bold and unyielding stance on trade matters, had recently announced a series of tariffs intended to shield domestic producers from what he perceived as unfair competition. In response, Mexico's government decided that its agricultural sector, which had long been a reliable source of exports to the United States, must be shielded from the uncertainties that these tariffs would introduce. This sudden measure sent shockwaves throughout both nations, raising important questions about the intersection of political ideology, economic strategy, and international diplomacy. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Before this incident, the trade relationship between the United States and Mexico had been characterized by a high degree of mutual dependency, with agricultural products forming one of the many pillars that supported a robust exchange of goods. For decades, Mexico had been one of the leading suppliers of fruits, vegetables, and other perishable goods to a market in the United States that relied on these imports to meet consumer demand. The agricultural supply chain, honed over years of cross-border cooperation, had grown into an essential component of daily life for millions of Americans, while simultaneously providing a steady income for Mexican farmers and agricultural businesses. The announcement of tariffs by the new U.S. president, with their intention of recalibrating trade imbalances and promoting domestic production, was viewed by many as a potential disruptor of this deeply interwoven network of commerce. The timing of the tariff announcement was critical, emerging during a period of heightened political tension and uncertainty on both sides of the border. In the United States, the newly elected leader had campaigned on a platform of economic nationalism, emphasizing the need to reclaim jobs and industries that had, according to his vision, been compromised by globalization and unfair trade practices. His tariffs were not merely a fiscal measure, but a signal of a broader shift in American trade policy, one that favored protectionist approaches over long-held commitments to free trade. This rhetoric resonated with certain segments of the American population and industries that felt neglected or adversely affected by previous trade agreements. However, it also set the stage for a dramatic reaction from Mexico, where officials and industry leaders recognized that such measures could have far-reaching consequences not only for the economy, but also for the delicate balance of diplomatic relations. The reaction from Mexico was swift and resolute, in a dramatic move that underscored the seriousness with which they regarded the emerging threat. Mexican authorities decided to halt all agricultural exports to the United States. This decision was not made lightly. It reflected a deep-seated concern that continuing trade under the new tariff regime would not only hurt Mexican farmers, but would also place them in a precarious position in an environment that was rapidly becoming unpredictable. For Mexican policymakers, the decision represented a strategic maneuver, a way to leverage the nation's considerable agricultural exports as a bargaining chip in a broader negotiation over trade and economic policy. It was an action that underscored the high stakes involved, as both countries were acutely aware that the stability of their trade relationship hung in the balance. The halt in exports had immediate implications for the agricultural sectors in both nations. On the Mexican side, the decision disrupted the livelihoods of countless farmers and workers who depended on the steady flow of goods to the United States. Many small-scale producers, who had worked for generations to cultivate a reputation for quality and reliability, suddenly found themselves facing the prospect of unsold produce and a market that was closing its doors. The economic disruption was not limited to individual livelihoods. It threatened to upend established supply chains that extended from rural farmlands to bustling urban markets. For many Mexican communities, agriculture was not only a means of sustenance, but also a cultural and economic cornerstone that had been nurtured over centuries. The stoppage of exports thus represented a profound challenge to a way of life that was intricately linked to the rhythms of the land and the cycles of trade. On the American side, the immediate impact was felt in the disruption of supply chains that had relied heavily on the steady influx of fresh produce from Mexico. The tariffs had been designed to protect American farmers, but the sudden cessation of Mexican exports created a vacuum that was difficult to fill. Supermarkets and distributors found themselves scrambling to source alternative suppliers, while consumers began to notice shortages and fluctuations in prices for familiar products. The move ignited debates among policymakers, industry leaders, and economists as they weighed the benefits of protecting domestic industries against the risks of undermining an established system of trade that had long contributed to a stable food supply. In urban centers and small towns alike, the halt in imports spurred a wave of uncertainty, with many questioning whether the new protectionist policies would ultimately serve the public interest or create unforeseen challenges. The broader economic implications of the halt were both complex and far-reaching. In a global economy where supply chains were increasingly interdependent, the decision underscored the vulnerabilities that could arise from sudden shifts in policy. The agricultural sector, with its intricate network of producers, distributors, and retailers, was particularly sensitive to such disruptions. Economists argued that while tariffs might offer short-term protection for certain domestic industries, they could also lead to inefficiencies and higher prices in the long run. In this instance, the decision by Mexico to halt exports was seen as a countermeasure that not only defended the interests of its own agricultural community, but also sent a stark warning to the United States about the potential consequences of unilateral trade policy changes. It highlighted the delicate balance that underpinned international commerce, where the actions of one nation could set off a chain reaction affecting multiple sectors of the economy. The event also had significant implications for the diplomatic relationship between the two countries. For decades, the United States and Mexico had maintained a pragmatic, if sometimes tense, relationship that was characterized by a mixture of cooperation and competition. The announcement of tariffs by the U.S. president was interpreted in Mexico as a move that disregarded the long-standing mutual interest that had guided trade relations for years. In response, the halt in agricultural exports was not merely an economic measure, but also a political statement, a demonstration of Mexico's resolve to protect its national interests in the face of what it perceived as an aggressive and unilateral policy. This decision, taken by Mexican authorities, served to underline the importance of mutual respect and the need for dialogue in addressing trade disputes, even as it escalated tensions between two nations that were more intertwined than ever before. The political narrative that emerged from this episode was one of defiance and retribution, with each side framing the events in terms of national pride and economic sovereignty. In the United States, the tariff announcement was heralded by supporters as a bold step toward reclaiming control over domestic industries and rectifying perceived imbalances in trade practices. For many, it was a necessary move in an era of globalization that had left certain segments of the population feeling marginalized. In contrast, the Mexican government's decision to halt exports was portrayed as a stand against coercion and a defense of national autonomy. The confrontation was thus imbued with a sense of ideological clash, where economic policy intersected with deep-seated views on national identity and sovereignty. The intensity of the rhetoric on both sides served to further polarize opinions, making it clear that the ramifications of the event would extend far beyond the immediate economic disruptions. Within the realm of agricultural policy, the halt in exports represented a stark departure from the traditional approaches that had long governed cross-border trade in the region. Historically, agricultural exchanges between the United States and Mexico had been managed through a combination of bilateral agreements and informal understandings that allowed for flexibility in the face of seasonal variations and market fluctuations. The abrupt cessation of exports, however, disrupted this equilibrium, forcing stakeholders to confront a reality in which the old norms no longer applied. For agricultural economists and policymakers, the incident raised important questions about the future of trade policy in an era marked by rising protectionism. The challenge of balancing domestic interests with the demands of a globalized economy became more acute, as the halt in exports underscored the need for new frameworks that could accommodate the competing interests of nations that were increasingly interdependent. The role of political leadership in shaping economic policy became a central theme in the unfolding drama. The newly elected U.S. president's decision to impose tariffs was rooted in a broader vision of economic self-determination, a vision that resonated with a significant portion of the American electorate. His policies were crafted with the intention of stimulating domestic production, reducing reliance on foreign imports, and ultimately revitalizing sectors that had been perceived as declining. However, the fallout from these policies, as evidenced by Mexico's drastic response, revealed the limitations of a unilateral approach to trade policy in a complex, interconnected world. The halt in agricultural exports was a vivid illustration of how the decisions made in the corridors of power could have ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate political context, affecting the lives of ordinary people on both sides of the border. The incident also prompted a re-examination of the long-term strategic relationships that had been built over decades of cross-border cooperation. Mexico's agricultural sector had not only been a major contributor to its domestic economy, but had also played a pivotal role in strengthening diplomatic ties with the United States. The decision to halt exports was a reminder that economic interdependence was not an immutable fact, but rather a dynamic relationship subject to the vagaries of political change. As the new tariff regime took shape, analysts began to consider the possibility that the traditional patterns of trade might need to be reconfigured in response to evolving economic realities. The possibility of alternative trade routes, new suppliers, or even shifts in consumer preferences loomed large in discussions about the future of agricultural commerce in the region, even as the immediate focus remained on the implications of the halted exports. In examining the economic dimensions of the event, it is clear that the halt in exports was more than just a temporary disruption. It was a recalibration of power dynamics in the trade relationship between the two nations. The decision by Mexico's government was driven by a desire to preserve the integrity of its agricultural sector and to ensure that its farmers were not forced into a disadvantaged position by sudden policy shifts in a major export market. This move highlighted the importance of having robust contingency plans and diversified trade partnerships in an increasingly volatile global market. It served as a stark reminder that economic policies, when implemented without careful coordination and dialogue, could lead to outcomes that reverberated across multiple sectors of the economy. The agricultural community, with its intricate network of stakeholders ranging from smallholder farmers to large-scale distributors, found itself at the nexus of a conflict that was as much about identity and national pride as it was about economics. The broader implications of the halt also touched on the themes of trust and reliability that underpin international trade. For decades, the United States and Mexico had engaged in a relationship built on the assumption that each side would honor its commitments and work collaboratively to address emerging challenges. The sudden cessation of agricultural exports challenged that assumption, forcing both sides to grapple with the realities of a relationship that could be rapidly redefined by shifting political winds. The event called into question the long-term viability of trade policies that were based on mutual dependency and underscored the need for a more resilient and flexible framework that could accommodate the uncertainties of a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. In this light, the decision by Mexico was not merely a reaction to an isolated policy announcement. It was a strategic repositioning aimed at safeguarding national interests in an unpredictable environment. As observers delved deeper into the implications of the halted exports, it became apparent that the move would have significant ramifications for the way in which agricultural products were marketed and distributed across the border. The intricate logistics of transporting perishable goods, which depended on finely tuned schedules and reliable supply chains, were suddenly thrown into disarray. Transport companies, storage facilities, and retail outlets that had long relied on the steady flow of imports were forced to reassess their strategies and seek out new sources of supply. The disruption not only affected pricing and availability, but also had the potential to alter long-standing relationships between producers and buyers. In an industry where margins were often thin and timing was critical, the uncertainty introduced by the halt threatened to destabilize an entire economic segment, creating ripples that could be felt far beyond the immediate confines of the agricultural market. The cultural dimensions of the event were equally significant. Agriculture in both the United States and Mexico was not merely an economic activity. It was woven into the fabric of daily life and carried deep historical and social significance. For many Mexican farmers, the land was a source of identity and pride, a legacy that had been passed down through generations. The decision to halt exports was imbued with a sense of urgency and resolve, as it was seen as a necessary stand to protect a way of life that was under threat from external forces. In the United States, the interruption of a familiar supply of fresh produce stirred up feelings of uncertainty and concern among consumers, many of whom had come to view Mexican agricultural products as a symbol of quality and consistency. The event thus served as a reminder that trade is not only about economics, but also about the exchange of cultural values and the maintenance of social bonds that transcend national borders. Political analysts and economic strategists alike began to debate the broader ramifications of the move, contemplating whether it signaled the beginning of a new era in international trade. The tariffs announced by the U.S. president were part of a broader agenda that sought to reshape the global economic order in favor of policies that prioritized national interests over multilateral cooperation. In this context, Mexico's decision to halt exports was a preemptive assertion of sovereignty, a message that the nation would not be forced into compliance with policies that were perceived as unilateral and detrimental to its own economic well-being. The confrontation highlighted the tensions that can arise when domestic political objectives clash with the realities of an interconnected global economy, prompting a re-evaluation of how trade disputes should be managed in a world where the stakes are higher than ever before. The strategic calculus behind Mexico's decision was underpinned by a careful assessment of the potential costs and benefits. Mexican officials, acutely aware of the importance of agriculture to both the national economy and the social fabric of rural communities, determined that the risks associated with continuing exports under the new tariff regime were too great to ignore. By halting exports, they aimed to preserve the long-term viability of their agricultural sector, even if it meant incurring short-term economic costs. This move reflected a broader strategy of economic resilience, a willingness to absorb immediate losses in order to protect key industries from more severe disruptions down the line. The decision underscored the need for policymakers to balance short-term exigencies with long-term objectives, a challenge that has become increasingly salient in an era characterized by rapid political and economic change. While the immediate focus of the event was on the economic and political dimensions, the halt in exports also cast a long shadow over the social dynamics that underpinned cross-border relations. The intermingling of communities on both sides of the border had long been facilitated by the flow of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. The sudden disruption of a major trade channel served as a stark reminder of how fragile these interconnections could be when subjected to the pressures of political rhetoric and unilateral policy decisions. Families and communities that had grown accustomed to a steady exchange of produce and mutual support now found themselves facing an uncertain future, where the simple act of buying a familiar fruit or vegetable could be fraught with complexity. This loss of continuity had the potential to erode the social cohesion that had been a hallmark of the border region for decades. Economic scholars have noted that the incident is emblematic of a broader trend in global trade, where the increasing adoption of protectionist policies has the potential to disrupt well-established networks of exchange. The decision by Mexico to halt agricultural exports serves as a case study in how nations can leverage their economic assets as a form of political capital. In a world where trade is both an engine of growth and a source of vulnerability, the ability to wield economic measures as tools of statecraft has become a critical component of national strategy. The event illustrates how a shift in policy in one country can provoke a calculated response in another, leading to a reconfiguration of the trade landscape that may have implications for years to come. At its core, the decision to suspend agricultural exports was driven by a profound sense of urgency and determination. For Mexican policymakers, the move was about more than just reacting to a single tariff announcement. It was about reaffirming a commitment to national sovereignty and economic self-reliance. The action resonated with long-held beliefs about the importance of protecting domestic industries and preserving the cultural heritage that was intimately linked with the land. It was a declaration that Mexico would not be compelled to submit to policies that it believed were not in its best interest, even if it meant disrupting a long-standing economic arrangement with its northern neighbor. This resolve reflected a broader trend among nations that were increasingly inclined to assert their autonomy in the face of global economic pressures, signaling a potential shift in the balance of power within international trade. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Mexico stopping all agricultural exports to the US after Trump's tariffs? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.